I'm going to introduce the great panel we have in a second. My name's John Morrison. I'm the Chief Executive of the Institute for Human Rights and Business. We call ourselves a think and do tank in the space of business and human rights. And it's a great pleasure to moderate the panel today. Human rights. I hope those of you who are British, or at least living in the United Kingdom, have voted today. Or if you haven't voted, you will do before 10 o'clock tonight. The right to vote is a human right. It took centuries to gain that right. Human rights are precious. They should not be political tools in election campaigns. I'd just like to single out the Mayor of London for some of the great statements he's made over recent days relating to the tragedy here at the weekend. Modern day slavery is an abuse of rights that is centuries old. The abuse is underneath the slavery. What do we mean? We mean forced labor. We mean human trafficking. We mean the denial of a whole cluster of labor standards and human rights. Again, these are well codified. They go back before the United Nations, a lot of them to the time of the League of Nations and the International Labour Organization in the 20s. But if we were to go in a timeship back 250 years, 75% of the world's population were either slaves or serfs or indentured labourers. These were people who could not vote, had very few rights, and if you think that the economic system back then was predicated on the abuse of rights, at least for the 75% of the world's population. Now, in many ways, the world is a better place than it was 75 years ago. 250 years ago. And sometimes people get cynical. Well, why are you using this modern-day slavery term? Surely you're just being emotive. You're trying to pretend that things were as bad as they were when the slave trade was operating, etc. Now, of course, in relative terms, things are a lot better. There are fewer. The percentage of the world's population who are slaves as a percentage is much smaller now than it was 250 years ago. But in absolute terms, in terms of number, whether it's 20 million or 30 million, that's a hell of a lot of people. There's still a lot of people in this world who are slaves or in slave-like conditions. And when it comes to business and the role of international supply chains, you could perhaps put the problem in three buckets. One is the deeply historical bucket, where people have been in slave-like conditions ever since 250 years ago or before, because of cultural norms, caste-based norms, etc. So there are still some people in this world who've never been liberated even from the first time round. The second is, I would say, as a vulnerability due to issues like migration. So if you think about Syrian refugees in Turkey, African refugees in North Africa, Libya, etc., you have large populations on the move who are then vulnerable to secondary exploitation. And in the worst conditions, that can be slave-like labour. Some of those might find their way into your supply chains. But the third category, I would say, is a direct response to global supply chains. It is an economic model that sees labour as a commodity, and particularly the third-party labour provision, which is in everybody's global supply chains, is where a lot of the vulnerability sits. These might be workers from South Asia moving to the Gulf, or anybody moving to Europe, etc., who are working for labour agencies, either legally or illegally, and might find their way into your supply chains. They might have their passports retained. They might be buying the jobs themselves by paying for jobs, even though that's against national law in most countries. So there's a complexity. The UK legislation, the Modern Day Slavery Act, which you'll hear the panel talk about again and again and again, wasn't the first piece of legislation to look at this issue. The legislation in the US predates it. It's interesting to see that the Australian government is currently consulting about similar legislation, and we know other G20 countries are interested, following the G20 Labour Minister statement in Hamburg last month. So we will begin to see more legislation on the basis of the Modern Day Slavery Act. How many companies are captured by it? Nobody knows precisely, because there's no registry of how many companies. We know the threshold of turnover, £36 million a year, but we don't know how many. The estimates are anywhere between 12,000 and 20,000 companies are captured. These aren't just UK companies. You just have to have some economic presence in this country. So hundreds of German companies are captured, for example, maybe even 1,000, well, certainly hundreds of US companies are captured by the UK legislation. So if we see more legislation popping up elsewhere, companies will be captured one way or the other. And so maybe the fundamental questions for the panel then are around the business case. How do you sell this within your companies to your, I mean, we have a CEO on the panel, but most of you are not CEOs, I guess. Congratulations if you are. How do you sell it to your boards, to your CEOs? How do you make the business case beyond the minimum of a short statement, of short disclosures? What does that look like? And I guess the question also, particularly to Oxfam as well, is the societal case. Does this legislation work? Does it really have impact? Does it really have benefit for the people we're talking about? Will it reduce the problem of modern day slavery? So we're going to go in this order, but I'll introduce the whole panel first. From the far side there, Steve Murrells, who's the CEO of the Cooperative group. Sarah Carpenter, who's a business and human rights analyst with Assent Compliance, based in Ottawa, Canada. And Mark Goldring, the CEO of Oxfam GB. Thank you very much, all of you, for being here. They're all each going to make short opening statements, then we'll get into a bit of a discussion, but then I'm going to come to you, and I'm also going to use this snazzy web-based thing to get questions as well. So, Steve, your opening remarks, please.
John, thank you, and hello, everybody. Before we get into modern slavery and why it's important to the Co-op, I thought it might be helpful just to tell you a bit about us and what we do, because in essence, what we do and who we are shapes our thinking and how we work in business. The Co-op was founded in 1844 by a group of people who came together to try and solve the issue of adulterated food and working conditions for people predominantly in factory environments. And it has spent the last 170 years championing a different way of doing business. In fact, that's very much the purpose that we have. We want to champion a different way of business for you and for your communities. We are made up of about 70,000 colleagues. Our businesses revolve around food retailing. We're a national food retailer. We're the largest funeral provider in the UK. We have a very successful insurance business, and we also have a very strong and successful legal business. And the ever challenge for us is being commercially successful, but being socially responsible. And our rich history shows that we campaign on important issues, and we think we make a difference. So from fair trade to loneliness to helping everybody in the world get access to free water, or in this case to modern slavery, because it's in the DNA and the values that we have, these places are important to us. And I was intrigued on John's point, very much starts at the top of our organisation as opposed to possibly starting at the bottom with many other companies. And therefore, if I consider modern slavery, it very much plays to our consciousness. And we think that we have a chance to bring a greater awareness to modern slavery through our supply chains, but also through paid employment. And we're now working with two charities to help us take victims and bring them into the workplace and offer them permanent employment, and therefore move them from a victim position into bringing them back into society, welcoming them into our business, paying them, and starting to make a real difference for them. And we spent the last 6 months with two charities, Snowdrop and City Hearts, putting in place a program where we can rehabilitate people who have gone through this terrible issue in the UK. Modern slavery, I think, to a lot of people is a 20th century problem, 19th century problem actually. It is live today, and we think we can make a real difference, and we're making a real difference on the ground. And we hope to have given jobs to over 30 victims this year, and then I think we have quite a progressive program to extend those numbers out over years ahead. So that's a bit about the co-op, what we're about, what we do, and why this is an important thing for us.
Thank you very much. Sarah.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, John. It's a real privilege to be here. So I, of course, work for Assent Compliance. We're a service provider for companies, so a lot of my perspective on how companies are responding to the UK Modern Slavery Act is informed by how I've seen our own clients respond. So in terms of what I've certainly seen, it galvanized action. Companies are, in many cases, for the very first time, taking action to tackle risks of slavery and human trafficking in their global supply chains, and I'll speak a bit more concretely about what action I've seen shortly. I think this is especially true for business-to-business companies. So unlike consumer-facing brands, they face different, pressures and pressures to address their adverse human rights impacts. So again, very much seen changes in behavior there as a result of the act itself. So historically, I would say that companies, let's say if they have a supplier code of conduct, it would include a general prohibition on forced labor. Some of the changes that I've seen is companies now are actually targeting key enablers and key contributors of forced labor in their supplier codes of conduct. So they're including prohibitions on recruitment fees, or including prohibitions on the withholding of their employee identification paper. I would also say that companies are taking, action to identify risks of slavery and human trafficking in their supply chain, so that they can then better target and prioritize their risk mitigation action. Leading companies aren't just looking at their tier 1 suppliers, so those suppliers with whom they have a direct contractual relationship. They're going deeper in their supply chain. They're also looking beyond suppliers who are involved in, let's say, manufacturing of their goods per se, and considering other suppliers, so indirect suppliers. So for instance, workers who are engaged in helping move their products from, let's say, their factories in Asia to their consumers in North America or Europe. And I think that's an important shift that I'm starting to see happen, because there's certainly those risks are vulnerable to slavery and human trafficking. Historically, I would say, so I will also say that I think companies are engaging their suppliers more and more on these issues, especially when it comes to screening for risk. They're asking more and more questions of their suppliers in terms of how they're controlling for risk within their own operations. Historically, companies, they would have used maybe their own set of questions or survey to do so. I'm seeing companies moving away from that. They're using a standardized survey in an interest of, supply chain data exchange efficiency, so that helps improve supplier response rates. From a resource efficiency perspective, companies aren't needing to design their own surveys, and it also actually helps improve data quality, and they're using the results that data to then inform their risk mitigation action. At this juncture in time, I think those are, two important actions that companies have taken. I think they're now reaching the point where they're actually starting to mitigate and prevent risk. I think we're in the early stages of that for many companies, so we'll certainly hopefully see progress on that year-on-year progress in upcoming years. The action that companies are taking is they're training suppliers on how to mitigate these risks. They're partnering with organizations, getting involved in multi-stakeholders initiatives or industry associations to tackle some of these really challenging problems. And they're also assessing their own purchasing practices for how their practices they themselves might be driving vulnerability, worker vulnerability in their own supply chains. I'll say a quick word on audits, because I know I'm running out of time. So audits, there are well-known challenges with audits. It's sort of well known that when it comes to forced labor auditors, they require a specific set of skills in order to be effective there. I will say, though, that companies, they are also increasingly taking a risk-based approach to auditing. So once they've collected data from their suppliers on how well they're controlling for risk, they can then better target their audit actions. So let's say if a supplier has responded and said, you know what, I'm actually not doing, there's room for improvement here in terms of how I'm controlling for risk. Companies, then say, thank you for your honesty. Let's work together to, get better here. But rather, they're targeting their audits towards those suppliers who have responded and said, we're doing a great job here at controlling for risks. So I'll leave those comments there, and I can certainly speak more about the business case, societal case in the Q&A.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for that. Mark, Oxfam is not just a leading NGO, but you're also captured by the Act itself, aren't you? So maybe...
Certainly. 2 or 3 years ago, I visited my wife's parents in a quiet, sleepy village in Wiltshire in the southwest of England. It's populated mostly by retired civil servants, generals, judges. And as we walked through the village, we saw a group of young Southeast Asian men standing on a street corner. It felt like a huddle. Rachel, who's grown up there, said, that's not what you often see in this village. And we talked a bit about it, and we carried on with our day. Thought no more. Earlier this year was a story that hit all of our news about an old tunnel in that very village that had been taken over, was actually growing cannabis. I always wondered why people in that village were happier than the rest of us. So there was a lighter side to these generals walking around sniffing and saying what a nice day it was. But there was a deadly serious side, which is that cannabis was being grown underground by slaves. And quite possibly those young men we'd seen on that street corner 3 years before were themselves slaves. And that's a reminder that slavery can exist anywhere. It doesn't look like it used to with all the caricatures from the 19th century. But forced labour, people who've had their travel documents taken off them, people who are being forced to work outrageous hours or locked up, people who may be children, all part of that picture of modern slavery. And as you said in your intro, Oxfam as a charity campaigning for rights, for justice and to end poverty has been working on this forever. Last year, we decided we would use the requirement to report on the Modern Slavery Act to really investigate, was Oxfam whiter than white on this? So look it up on the website if you want to. It's there in public. There's a 60-page report where we've actually examined our own ways of working, and we found ourselves wanting. We haven't found slaves, no company's found slaves, but we really looked how far back do we have confidence in our supply chain. And we realized that, like all of you, we have a lot of confidence at one step. We don't necessarily have a lot of confidence further upstream. And as Sarah said, or Steve said, this is a problem that's actually getting worse. We see from our wider work that mass migration across the Med and through the Balkans is actually increasing slavery. We've been asked by companies in Italy to actually work with them on helping ensure that they are not using forced labour or trafficked labour in their own supply chain, where they never thought they needed to do that a couple of years ago. So what have we learned from our wider work, including our own self-audit for the Modern Slavery Act? We've learned that you can't look at slavery alone. If companies try and get it right on slavery, you're missing the point. You need to look at labour rights, labour well-being in your whole spectrum. You need to look at issues of the ability of labour to organise and to speak to management, and to speak beyond management when they are a second or third tier supplier. So we've tried to open up ways of having that dialogue all the way down the chain. Many of the countries that many of us source products from, and Oxfam buys products just like any other company, really have a lot of limitations on labour organisation. So where you can't have a trade union, and trade unions will not put up with slavery, where you can't have a trade union, you need to look at staff engagement. And you need to look separately at women, and you need to look separately at men. You need to look at different tiers in the labour force, not just who are the workers' representatives at official levels. And you need to work that right down. So it's a kind of partnership with labour force rather than an us and them approach. You need to look at another sort of partnership, which is with other companies. They may be your competitors in many spheres, but no company wants to employ slaves, or they don't want to employ people who employ slaves. We've seen some of the best work on labour rights being done when garment manufacturers have come together or tea growers have come together, and they've seen this as a common problem for them to deal with openly, because nobody wants, as you said, 1,000 different audits from different inspectors. Among other things, you become very good at conning the auditors. But that joint approach helps identify risk, and that helps identify a response. You need to work in partnership with governments, because where you see long-standing problems, such as seafood industries in Southeast Asia, brick making in India, actually governments have got to be part of that solution too, and big companies like yours have a lot of influence with those governments. And you need to have partnerships in the way that Steve described with local organisations, not just labour organisations, but local NGOs who are working on rights, who are engaged with the community, whether it's at the sourcing end or at the trafficked end. Both of them can play a useful role. What we've seen is that we have great codes, we work with fair trade suppliers, we have very little turnover in our suppliers, we do the right checks. We were not doing enough risk-based analysis. We were treating it as a straightforward, let's do the homework, which of course only goes so far. If you do a risk-based analysis and you begin to see patterns of companies where everyone is doing huge amounts of overtime, you see companies with very high proportion of casual labour, you focus your attention much more forcefully, and actually you drill down, because you need those goods, but you need to get them in an ethical way. And my final point is that we all know that auditing is part of this, but as Sarah said, it's not the answer. The answer is, do your next tier of suppliers actually want to fix this? And do their partners want to fix it? Otherwise, you're all trying to con each other. So if you can actually tease out, are you willing to work with us on getting this right? You'll get a lot further than have you got it right at the moment. And those suppliers that want to work on it will want to drive down to the next level. So my final point is, Oxfam found we had not done this thoroughly enough, and it's our business. That probably means that many other companies, other organisations, are not doing it thoroughly enough. So if we commit ourselves not just to the abolition of slavery, but of abusive labour, and we take the holistic picture of labour engagement, I hope I've offered some steps that might help work on. There are many practical elements within that risk assessment and within the actions that we take that we can pick up in the discussion.
Mark, thank you very much. That was excellent. We'll come back to that sort of cluster of rights that you mentioned in a second. You also, reminded us that NGOs are captured by the Act, as large NGOs as well as business. What's interesting, of course, government itself is not captured by the Act. So 20% of GDP is public procurement in most countries. That government departments themselves at the moment do not have to report under the Act, although there are people in Parliament who are trying to change the Act. But certainly it's a live issue in many parts of the world. When such legislation comes forward, if government itself, as an economic actor, is not making the same commitment that Oxfam is, for example, as an NGO, before preaching to companies, why should people take government, in a sense? Because government itself is a powerful economic actor. So that's also a very live point. We're going to come to you for questions in the next 5-10 minutes, but just to warm you up a bit, how many of you have already reported, or your organisations have already reported under the UK Modern Day Slavery Act? Put your hands up. well, I'm guessing here we have about 20, would you say 20 there? How many of you are going to report under the UK Modern Day Slavery Act? We've probably got another 10. So I'm assuming the rest of you either don't know what it is, or you don't know, or you're not captured by it, or whatever. Okay. Let's come back. Sarah, I want to just drill down with you a little bit on this. This issue of this basket of issues, these salient. What are the, when you look for this in global supply chains, I think Mark really started to unpack that a bit. Does that concur with what you look for when you look at this issue? Do you want to, are they the right issues that companies, auditors and others should be looking at?
Yes, totally. I mean, I loved what Mark said, that, I mean, a key sort of strategy for tackling these issues is generally to tackle, to promote labor rights throughout a company's supply for a company to promote labor rights throughout their supply chain, because worker vulnerability is a key contributor to modern slavery. So once progress is made on those specific issues, then workers are generally less vulnerable to these abuses.
Great. Okay, thank you. Steve, as a CEO of a company, I mean, I don't know who your legal counsel is in the Co-op group, but I don't want to characterize the legal counsel of a company. But when I used to work in a company, for example, legal counsels obviously might see companies disclosing risks about things that sit outside the direct control of a company as a risky thing to do. So how do you have a wonderful legal counsel in your company who completely gets it? Or do you just ignore them? Or can you, because I think for many companies in the room, legal counsel is one of the places where there can be some resistance to disclosure.
Yes. We have a pretty robust risk register. It's not the exciting thing that we do, but it's there, it keeps us honest, and things like supply chain issues, Brexit, worker pay, all those things are on our risk register. And I think that's important because it keeps you honest, it keeps you grounded, and it's a guardrail to make sure that you're not ignoring it and that you're facing into it and wanting to make a difference. And I was just reflecting on both Sarah and Mark's comments about, I think our role in the Co-op is about playing a really important awareness point. We don't guarantee that there is no modern slavery in all of our supply chains. What we do guarantee, though, is when we find it, seek it out, that we will then work to solve it. But I think you have to do it in a way that's shoulder to shoulder with your partners. Yeah. The moment that you tend to go a little bit too heavy-handed in here is that it gets closed down, it gets put underground, and as Mark alluded to, having spent the last 20 years sourcing product from around the world, people are very skilled about knowing when the auditor's going to turn up, very skilled about keeping the auditor at the front gate whilst things are sorted in the background. And that's just an unfortunate symptom of trying to solve a problem in the wrong way. So we have a risk register that keeps us honest. It's on there. It does not get in the way of us not facing into it because it's in our DNA. It's something that we do. And I think the moment that you start to think of modern slavery as a P&L point, you're in the complete wrong place. I think Kevin Hyland, who's the independent anti-slave commissioner, said that the moment you start thinking about modern slavery through the lens of achievement, you just know you're in the wrong place.
Right.
This is something that we should be doing, but you can't put a return on it. You have to put investment in, you have to put people on the ground, you have to put pound notes behind it, but don't expect to get anything back for it, because actually you're going into it for the wrong reason if that's why you're doing it.
Right, I want to come to Mark, but Sarah, you wanted to come in briefly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I completely agree with what you've just said, and I just wanted to sort of add on that a bit. I agree that I think kind of a partnership approach with suppliers to tackle these issues is really important. Historically, I've heard companies speak about, let's say, forced labor issues as being a zero tolerance issue. Fine, but that encourages then suppliers to, hide any challenges that they might be facing in this regard. So something that I've recently heard from a company actually that really resonated with me is, in their view, there are two zero tolerance issues. It's a lack of transparency and a lack of continuous improvement. And for everything else, they're keen to work with their suppliers to help improve their practices.
So, Mark, we're hearing a lot about partnership approaches
Yeah.
that can take time, can take resources. Do they work? Is there any evidence out there that we're actually making some progress in fighting this issue?
Yeah. I want to answer your question. I first want to pick up on something that Steve said as well. You asked about legal counsel driving this.
Yeah.
Actually, what Steve said in his intro, which I think is really important, is if it's being driven at the top level, it's not being driven by legal counsel, it's being driven by the chief exec and the board.
Yeah.
And for those people who are the kind of CSR gurus in their company, it's recognizing that that's what will make a difference. And if you can get your senior leaders recognizing that this is nobody wants to be part of a company that uses slavery. Nobody wants to buy from it, no one wants to work for it, no one wants to invest in it. And then you extend that into abuses in the workplace, exploitation, so it's not formal slavery.
Yeah.
And you start that at the top, then you're really making progress, and the rest of the things will fall into
And the Act
place.
requires that there's board sign-off every year, doesn't it?
It does, but the Act also allows people to do a one-line
Yes.
submission. So it's getting the company to see that this is an opportunity,
Yeah.
which is actually it's the company of the future.
Yeah.
It's about organizational health, not just about formal compliance.
Yeah.
So to me, does it make a difference? It depends on how the companies endorse that. But what we're seeing is a partnership approach does make a difference.
Right.
And to use an example, and I saw there's a
Yeah,
question on
please
there
pick
that
any
says,
questions. Yeah.
would you stop working with a supplier that refuses to comply? Well, legally, of course, only certain companies have to comply with that. In terms of reporting, that's different from is it legal to use slaves? And we've been experimenting with a clause in our standard contracts that actually says, not just do you comply with the Act, but will you work with us to drive the requirements of the Act through the whole operation. So that's requiring companies to say, we'll look at our own supply chain, even when we're selling to you. And we're actually exploring that. Now, we don't yet know how much difference it will make.
Right.
And will it become another kind of compliance issue where they keep you at the door while they go out and get things? But that's what we're trying to do.
Okay.
And all of us have got choice in our supply chain, not infinite choice.
Yeah.
But if we're actually looking at that willingness to work together alongside issues of price and reliability and all the other factors, then I think we actually will make progress.
Thank you. We've got some very interesting questions coming up here. By far the most, the biggest thumbs up, 18 thumbs up, anonymous, unpaid placements, especially targeted at young people, are very prevalent in the UK. Is this an abuse of the Modern Day Slavery Act? So we can't ignore that question. I'm hoping that particularly you two gentlemen will have a good response to that. How can companies collaborate to help improve, not just audit supplier performance on human rights? I think that's from Oliver Hurry. I think we've touched that actually already. And with the proliferation of new regulations on the subject, we would benefit from a global standard to focus energies where needed on better control. That's MCABB. I would iterate there that there are global standards. The ILO Protocol on Forced Labour 2014 is a global standard. I think every country in the world, with the exception, I think it was of Thailand initially, has signed that. And now that's being incorporated in domestic legislation around the world. But the supply chain element of that is voluntary. So the way that governments interpret that in national legislation, they can leave out the supply chain element completely, or they can have it as complete woolliness. So unfortunately, the international standards we have at the moment do not help us with the human rights due diligence component of it. It remains discretionary for governments whether they include that or not. Anybody want to come back on any of those questions?
Just on a couple on the first one, which is, I think, a great question. I don't know where it was coming from, but if I look at the apprenticeship scheme that we have, where we'll effectively appoint 1,000 young apprentices every year, we pay them the standard rate, which is considerably more than the government's apprenticeship rate, because we think it's really important. And if you just take the national living wage position, we wouldn't discriminate between an 18-year-old or a 25-year-old. So I think pay is very important, and you've got to set the right tone. What I observe around the world is that when you get into these subjects, everybody's got huge energy about them, but with that comes so many different ways of working, organisations, different schemes, and the quicker that we can pull our resources together and try and get some universal standards and approaches, SEDEX being one example where 1,700 of our own branded suppliers self-audit on the SEDEX scheme. The quicker we can become a lot more consistent in the approach, I think it would be a lot better. We get more cut through. Where I have a slight concern that we're all in our own ponds doing our own stuff, whereas the sum of the parts coming together would actually give us a stronger outcome.
Thank you. If Kevin Highland was here, he would probably reiterate the point that the risk for companies doesn't always sit in Southeast Asia or South Asia, a bit close to home, as you were saying, Mark. Did you want to come back? I mean, whether it's the work placement issue or...
Yes, no, I would be very clear. I would not equate an unpaid placement with modern slavery. It may be abusive. Many unpaid placements are actually very positive, and they tend to be short, specific, and geared at that individual's learning. They're abusive where companies are getting work done for nothing that is actually their regular work, and they're having a series of unpaid interns. I still wouldn't equate that with slavery. But as I said, I really urge us all not just to look at slavery, but to look at inappropriate use of a workforce and look much more broadly if we want to be good citizens and if we want the public to have confidence in us. My Wiltshire example is a reminder that this does occur close to home, and there are areas in which we need to take special care. And we really well understand what some of those areas are. Many of them in the UK actually relate to us as personal consumers, whether it's car washes or nail bars, rather than to companies.
Yes.
But there may well be those which are actually related to companies. And what we've learnt when we audited our own practice for our own modern slavery report, and we looked at the fact that we were using a fairly standardised approach, I think what we now know is depending on which country and which industry, and also, as you said, Sarah, some of the telltale signals, such as do people get to keep their own documents, those kinds of issues then give you a signal as to whether you need to dig deeper. If we're doing that, we need to do it at home as well as in other countries.
Well said. Yeah. Sarah, final word to you before I go to the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't mind touching actually on that, the comments that you made about sort of having a standard on this. I mean, in a way, I would argue we already do, as you have, right? You can look to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, for instance, which represent the global consensus on businesses' responsibilities with human rights and how conducting due diligence with regards to that. I will sort of, to tack on to that, urge us all to not just view the UK Modern Slavery Act in isolation. It sort of stems from this global principles, but there's a number of regulations worldwide that are emanating, and they aim to just generally drive companies to conduct due diligence on their global supply chains. So it could be a transparency provision like the UK Modern Slavery Act or the California Transparency and Supply Chains Act that you referenced earlier out of the US, but there's also hard compliance requirements for any companies in the room who are contractors with U.S. federal contractors or subcontractors are well aware of the U.S. Federal Acquisition Regulation and the new regulation out of France. And then there's another sort of way in which governments are driving business behavior in this scheme is they're conferring specific benefits to companies in return for demonstrating due diligence. So again, the U.S. has done this in recent years. Yeah. They've closed a loophole so that now there's a prohibition on the import of goods into the U.S. that were made with forced labor. And that's a huge risk for companies if they aren't able to demonstrate that they've conducted due diligence in that regard. So anyway, those...
Yes, yes, well said. I mean, the US government is the only one that has pushed this through federal public procurement. Yeah. Right. Shall we just take a cluster of questions from the audience? We'll take one group, I think. I'm allowed to do that, am I? I guess so. We're not all computer-based now. So the old-fashioned way, I believe, is to raise a hand in the air, and that will indicate to me that you have a question. If you could identify yourself at the beginning, and I'll take as many as I can see. Sir.
Hi, I'm Kanishk.
We have a microphone there.
Thank you. I'm Kanishk Negi from ABB. In a lot of countries, we see that there are homegrown industries, kind of companies who kind of support or facilitate the employment of the workers in different countries, in outside their home country. And they do charge your fees from the guys to facilitate that. Now, would you consider that in the ambit of modern slavery or as payment for getting the employment? That's first part. And also in certain specific countries, we've seen the national governments coming up with the provisions of where they allow the companies to actually deduct from the wages of the workers certain proportions that they have paid to the companies have actually paid to the agents to import these workers into their country. How do you deal with those kinds of governments? Because surely it's not entirely within the scope of a private sector enterprise to influence in one go. I mean, there needs to be a larger public policy debate on this and a lobbying on this. It would be interesting to know your views on these points.
That's an excellent question, sir. I would say that because that's an issue we work on. So, come on. Oh, at the back there. Yeah. And then we'll go back to the panel to respond and also give their final comments, and then we'll have lunch. Yes.
So my name's Andrew Almack. I'm the CEO of Plastics for Change. My question is related to how companies can drive efficiencies into their supply chain while also tackling modern-day slavery, specifically to how it relates to some of the global commodities. So, for example, plastic is a big example where globally it's an informal economy with a lot of different social and economic dependencies at the base of the supply chain. And are there any case studies of big victories where companies have been able to engage and create a more effective supply chain while also creating interventions to reduce the modern day slavery?
Thank you, sir. If there's none others, then I'll come back to the panel. There's that question. The one about payment to agents is critical. It's illegal in most countries, but it happens in most countries. Yeah. In some countries it is legal, some countries in Southeast Asia. I found out last month it's actually legal in Germany to pay agents up to a certain amount, which really blew me away because I thought there was an EU standard on this. Anybody want to come back on any of those points or final comments as well? Yeah.
I'd like to pick up the issue of fees and deductions because we work as Oxfam in many countries which are massively dependent on remittances. And if we look at South Asia, those remittances are the lifeblood of the economy, many coming from Middle East. Fees and deductions are inevitably going to be involved, and that doesn't feel to me to be per se wrong. But what we're seeing, and where it links with slavery, is ever-growing fees, interest rates being charged on them, deductions which are totally disproportionate to real costs. And what we see, and this is just as true in Britain, with migrant labour being brought across informally for the agricultural industry, is that can be massively abusive and becomes a form of slavery because effectively people are getting more and more in debt.
Yeah.
So to me, it's not the principle of is an honest fee for an honest service automatically wrong. It's when it then results in systems of bonding that are usually aggravated by the confiscation of the identification documents, which is where we lead to the kind of situation that you see in Qatar and many other countries where people are effectively bonded and unable to move. So it's the control and the abuse that is crucial, I think.
We'll have a gentleman's disagreement on this one.
Right.
I mean, it's interesting in Qatar, it's against national law in Qatar to charge these fees.
Okay.
In the whole of the Gulf, it's against law to charge these fees, and yet it happens.
Yeah.
And it happens in country of origin. And often then you have double payments. You have the company paying, And people and the workers are still paying in Nepal and Bangladesh, etc.
Fair point.
And so you have then parallel systems.
So the fact that some payment needs to be made to pay for that service is different from how it's done, who
Correct.
pays it, and
it's
how
the,
it's abused.
It's the employer that should
Yeah.
pay in terms of international standards.
Yeah.
Sarah.
I mean, I could briefly touch on the question with regards to supply chain efficiencies. I mean, it reminded me of, another argument in favor, and this is again to buttress the business case for taking action on modern slavery risks is, it's to reduce the risk against supply chain disruption. If forced labor is found within, a supplier's operations, they could then no longer be able, be in a position to manufacture goods for a certain company, which could then, impact their ability to sell to their consumers. So that's what reminded, that's sort of what came to mind in reference to that question there that I wanted to raise.
Thank you.
I think just carrying on from that point, and I think it's a thread for me during this conversation is that I wouldn't encourage the co-op group to go into this issue through a lens of efficiency. I think our challenge is the more commercial we can be successful in other parts of our business, the more good we can then do in these areas to make a real difference. So you work it really hard over here, you become really efficient over here, so that you can then do the right thing over here. Now, as we've found with fair trade over the last 25 years, being on the ground, having a guaranteed payment to fair trade suppliers and their workers has ensured greater availability, greater consistency of supply, and a greater quality of product. Not, however, on our radar would be the efficiency in terms of getting a banana from a plantation here to here. That kind of comes with doing the right things, but it shouldn't be the lever and the trigger for doing it. There is this practical world as CEOs, and with all of you, which is you've got to work harder here to invest over here, but don't over here consider this is going to be contributing to your bottom line because you get in the wrong place. And then it becomes a kind of a reciprocity model, and you build the momentum, and the more success that you are able to talk about, you'll find, certainly my experience has been, the more keen businesses are to do the right thing, because I think the vast majority want to do the right thing.
Thank you very much. Right, I'm just about to close. Yes, thank you. After lunch, please note we have 4 tracks running, and those of you who are running in track D, you'll know who you are. That's the clean energy track. The workshop is in Moore, London, which means a lot to all of you because you know the hotel better than I do. But please thank Steve, Sarah and Mark in the traditional way. I think it's been a great panel, and thank you very much.